I've seen a lot in my life. Broken bones, broken tools, broken promises. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the day my own son looked me dead in the eye and said those words I'll never forget. Dad, you can't live here anymore. You're just too much of a burden. You know, it's strange how a single sentence can freeze time. The world keeps moving. Cars passing, rain tapping, a dog barking somewhere down the street. But you stand there, still as a statue, trying to make sense of what just happened. For me, that sentence wasn't just sound. It was a knife, slow and cold, finding its way straight into my chest. I was standing on his porch, holding my old green duffel bag, the same one I'd used since my younger days on construction sites. It wasn't heavy, just a few shirts, a pair of work boots, my worn-out Bible, and a small framed photo of his late mother, Sarah. That photo had been through more than most people. The corners were bent, the glass cracked from years of being tucked inside boxes and bags, but her smile never faded. It reminded me of home, of warmth, of a time when our little family actually meant something. That day, the sky looked like it was grieving with me. The rain was steady, not the kind that rages, but the kind that falls slow and quiet like tears you've run out of strength to hide. It soaked through my jacket, through my shirt, until the cold settled deep inside my bones. Each drop hit the wooden steps beneath my boots like a ticking clock, counting the seconds I stood there waiting for him to take it back. Waiting for him to say it was a mistake. But he didn't. He couldn't even meet my eyes for long. He just stood there, shoulders tense, jaw tight, pretending he was doing the right thing. Behind him, through the glass door, I could see his wife, Melissa, watching from the hallway. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable, but I could tell she was the storm behind his words. She was always polite in public, but her eyes told me the truth. She never liked me. Maybe I didn't fit the picture of the successful family she wanted to show off. Maybe my calloused hands and worn-out boots embarrassed her. I didn't say a word. I just looked at my boy. The same boy I'd once taught to ride a bike, the same kid who used to run toward me after school yelling, "Dad!" Now standing there like a stranger. He swallowed hard, and in a voice that trembled between guilt and pride, he said, "Please, Dad. Just go. I'll send you some money when I can." Money. That word stung more than anything. It wasn't about the amount. It was about what it meant. My son thought the solution to love, to family, to years of sacrifice was money. He thought he could buy peace of mind by sending a few bills every month. It made me realize how far apart we'd grown. Not in miles, but in values. I didn't argue, I didn't beg, because a father's pride, even when it's bleeding, when it won't let him crawl. I just nodded once, the kind of nod that hides 1,000 words. I lifted my bag, turned toward the steps, and started walking away. Slow, steady, like each step was carrying a lifetime. The wooden boards creaked under my weight, and for a split second I hoped to hear him call out, "Dad, wait." But all I heard was the sound of the door closing behind me, a soft click. Final. Clean and cruel. I remember pausing at the end of the driveway. The rain was falling harder now, blurring the world in silver streaks. I looked back once, not because I wanted to, but because something inside me needed closure. Through the curtain I could barely make out his shadow, standing still in the hallway. Maybe he was watching, maybe he wasn't. But he didn't come out. My boots sank slightly into the wet gravel as I walked away. I could feel the cold water running down my neck, but I didn't care. My mind was louder than the rain. Every memory came flooding in. His first birthday, his first bike, the time he helped me carry lumber, even though it was twice his weight. I'd promised his mother, before she passed, that I'd always protect him, that I'd never let him feel alone. Funny how life turns that promise around. I reached the main road and stood under a streetlight. The glow flickered, yellow and weak, but it was enough to see my breath in the cold air. I dropped my bag to the ground and sat down on the curb. For a long while I just watched the rain slide down the asphalt, forming little rivers that carried away bits of dirt and leaves, and I realized something. Maybe this was what life does when it wants to wash away the lies we've been living under. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in a small motel room off the highway, the kind where the air smells like old coffee and cigarette smoke. The sheets were thin, the heater groaned, and the neon light outside kept blinking through the curtains like it couldn't decide if I deserved darkness or light. I stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying every word, every look, every silence. I asked myself, where did I go wrong? Did I fail as a father, or did I raise a son who just forgot what love costs? But as the night stretched on, something inside me shifted. Somewhere between regret and heartbreak, a quiet kind of strength started to grow. It wasn't anger, no, I'd seen what anger does to men. It burns quick, then leaves you hollow. This was different. This was resolve. Because that night, I made myself a promise I would not die a broken man. Not in spirit, not in dignity, and someday my son would see the truth. He would learn, not through words, but through the weight of reality, who his father truly was. People think revenge is about payback. It's not. It's about revelation. It's about watching time peel back the lies until the truth stands bare, undeniable. And that's what this story is, not a cry for pity, not a tale of bitterness, but a story of truth, justice, and the quiet power of a man who refused to stay small. Because the day my son shut that door on me, he didn't just push out his father. He awakened the man who built everything he was standing. I wasn't always poor. People look at me now, gray hair, old jacket, shoes that have seen better days, and they see a man who's had his time. But what they don't know is that I built more than homes in my life. I built dreams. I built a name. I built a family. And every brick, every nail, every drop of sweat had purpose. It all started in my late 20s, right after I married Sarah. She was 25 then, full of light, with that quiet strength country women have, soft voice, hard hands, and a laugh that could pull me out of any bad day. We didn't have much when we started out, but what we lacked in money, we made up for in faith and fight. We bought an old pickup truck, blue paint peeling off, transmission barely holding together. I remember spending 3 nights fixing that thing with a flashlight and a borrowed wrench set. When it finally started, Sarah stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee and that teasing grin of hers and said, "Well, look at that, George. Our first employee finally showed up, and he's late." That was Sarah, always finding humor even when life wasn't funny. We used that truck to start Miller Construction, just a name painted in white letters on the side. No fancy office, no marketing, just me, a toolbox, and the belief that hard work still meant something. At first, jobs were small, fixing porches, mending fences, patching leaky roofs. I'd come home late, hands raw and blistered, but Sarah never complained. She'd have dinner waiting, simple things like stew or cornbread, and we'd sit on the porch eating while the sun went down. We talked about everything, the future, the house we wanted, the family we'd raise. Then, when our boy David was born, it felt like the whole world stopped for a second. He came into this world screaming loud, fists clenched as if he already knew life wasn't going to be easy. Sarah held him close, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "He's going to build a life better than ours." And I swore right there I'd make sure of it. When David turned 5, he became my little shadow. Every morning he'd jump into the truck with me, his tiny legs dangling off the seat, his plastic lunchbox rattling with peanut butter sandwiches Sarah packed. At the job sites, the men used to laugh when they saw him running around with a little hard hat that barely fit his head. He'd pick up nails, hand me tools, and puff out his chest when the workers called him Little Miller. He loved it, the noise, the smell of sawdust, the way the sun hit the lumber stacks. He'd tell everyone with that proud grin only a kid can have, "One day I'm going to build big buildings like my dad." And Sarah, standing nearby with her camera, would shake her head laughing. "He's got your hands, George, but I hope he gets my patience. Those were golden years. We didn't have luxury, but we had peace. The kind of peace you only find when your work is honest and your home is warm." I'd tuck David in at night. Sarah would hum softly in the kitchen, and I'd think, this is it. This is everything a man could want. But life has a cruel way of reminding you how fragile happiness really is. It doesn't send a warning, doesn't knock first, and it just walks in and takes what it wants. Sarah started feeling tired one winter. At first, we thought it was just the flu. Long hours, cold weather. She'd smile and wave off my worry, saying, "I just need rest, George. Don't make a fuss." But the tiredness stayed. Then came the dizziness, the hospital visits, the endless tests. I still remember the day the doctor came into the room in a white coat, tired eyes, and told us it was cancer. The word felt heavy, too big for that small space. Sarah just sat there, calm, holding my hand while my heart dropped into my boots. For a while she fought. God, she fought hard, chemo, surgery, more chemo. I watched the strongest woman I'd ever known fade before my eyes. Her laughter grew weaker, her hands colder, but she never stopped smiling for David. She'd brush his hair back and whisper, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Mommy's just getting stronger," but she wasn't. And when David turned 15, she was gone. She passed quietly one morning right as the sun came up. I was holding her hand, and for the first time, she didn't squeeze back. I remember looking at David, standing by the door, his face pale, eyes red, trying to be brave. He didn't cry in front of me, and not once. He just went to his room, closed the door, and stayed there for hours. After the funeral, he changed. The laughter disappeared. The warmth between us started to cool. I tried everything, fishing trips, long talks, working side by side, but he kept pulling away. He'd spend hours in his room studying, always saying he was fine. He started dressing differently, speaking differently, dreaming differently. By the time he left for college, he wasn't my little boy anymore. He was a young man I could barely recognize. Still, I told myself he was just growing up. Kids move on, that's life. I didn't realize he wasn't just moving forward. He was moving away from who we were. The first time I visited him at his college, I noticed something. His friends were from well-off families, like polished shoes, clean cars, the kind who'd never worked a day outside in the heat. When they asked what I did, David quickly said, "My dad manages small properties back home." I chuckled at first, thought maybe he was just simplifying it. But when I looked at his face, I saw embarrassment, that little pause in his voice, that nervous smile. He didn't want them to know his father was a construction worker. That night, as I drove back home alone, I stared at my hands on the steering wheel, calloused, cracked, covered in tiny scars from decades of labor. And for the first time, I wondered if these same hands that once built his dreams now made him ashamed. Still, I didn't blame him. I told myself it was just youth, pride mixed with insecurity. He'd find his way back. He'd remember where he came from. But I was wrong. After Sarah's death, I kept the business running. Work became my way to keep her close. Every plank I nailed, every home I finished, I felt like she was still there beside me. But David rarely called. Weeks turned into months, months into years. He graduated, got a job in the city, a big real estate firm. He started wearing suits, talking about investments, profits, and market shares, things I'd never cared for. I still remember the day he bought his first house. He called me, excited, saying, "Dad, I made it." And I was proud, I really was. I thought maybe, just maybe, this success would bring him closer again. But little did I know that success would become the wall between us, brick by brick, built by pride and distance. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that were already forming. I just didn't want to admit it, because every father wants to believe his son still remembers where he came from, that somewhere deep down, the boy who once wore a tiny hard hat still loves the man who taught him how to hold a hammer. But I was wrong about that too. And soon, I'd find out just how far my son had drifted. It's strange how silence can become louder than words. That's how it was between me and David. Years had gone by since he'd left for the city. He had climbed his way up from an intern to a regional manager at a real estate firm, a job that paid more than I'd ever dreamed of. And I was proud, truly proud. But beneath that pride, there was something heavier, something that sat deep in my chest like wet cement. The feeling that somewhere along the way, I'd lost my boy. I used to call him every Sunday. At first, he'd answer. Short conversations, rushed but polite. "Hey, Dad, I'm busy, but I'm good." Then it turned into missed calls. Then text that said, "Can I call later?" And then eventually nothing at all. When I'd drive out to see him, his tone was polite but distant, like a neighbor being courteous, not a son greeting his father. I told myself it was just life. People get busy, families drift. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't fit in his world anymore. The first time I visited his new house, I parked my old Ford pickup in his spotless driveway. His neighbors' cars looked like they'd come straight out of magazines, glossy, brand new, expensive. My truck, with its faded paint and dented bumper, stuck out like a sore thumb. I caught a few glances from the folks walking their dogs, the kind of looks that politely say, "You don't belong here." David came out wearing a tailored shirt, his hair slicked back, confident, crisp, polished. He smiled when he saw me, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dad, you made it," he said, like he wasn't expecting me to actually show up. "Of course," I laughed, clapping his shoulder. Wouldn't miss my own son's housewarming. Inside, everything was shiny and modern. White walls, spotless floors, and a chandelier that probably cost more than my entire house. His wife, Melissa, floated toward me with that practiced grace you only learn from caring too much about appearances. "George," she said, stretching my name like it was a task. "So glad you could make it." I handed her a small wooden frame I'd carved myself, a picture of David and Sarah, his mom, when he was 10. The smile she gave me didn't reach her eyes either. "Oh, how thoughtful," she said, setting it aside like it didn't match the furniture. That's when I knew. I wasn't just from another world. I was from a world she didn't want in her living room. A few months later, David called. I thought maybe he wanted to catch up, but no. His voice was all business. "Dad," he said, "the fence in the backyard's falling apart. If you have time this weekend, maybe you could take a look." I smiled. "Of course, son. I'll bring my tools." It felt good, you know, like old times. Me working on something he needed. Maybe it was a small chance to reconnect. So that Saturday I loaded up my pickup and drove down. I knocked on the door and Melissa opened it. She looked surprised, then nervous. "Oh," she said, glancing behind me. "Yous actually came." David came out half-dressed for golf. He scratched his neck awkwardly. "Yeah, Dad, about that. I already called a contractor. You didn't have to come all this way." I laughed, thinking he was joking. "What contractor?" "I'm already here." He looked away. "Yeah, I just figured you'd be tired and they could handle it." That's when Melissa added, "Yes, George, please don't take it the wrong way. We just want it done properly, you know, with permits and all that." Her voice was sugar-coated poison. I stared at my son, the same boy who once sat on my shoulders watching fireworks, who used to call me his hero, and now he couldn't even let me fix his damn fence. I swallowed hard. "Sure, son. I get it." He smiled faintly. "You understand?" "Understand?" I understood too well. I understood that I was embarrassing him, that my calloused hands and old pickup didn't fit his new life, that Melissa didn't see a father-in-law. She saw a reminder of everything she'd married out of. So I turned around, loaded my tools back into the truck, and drove home. No words, no tears, just the quiet hum of the road and the sting of realization. That night I sat on the porch staring at Sarah's picture. The moonlight caught the frame just right, and I could almost hear her voice. "Don't let pride build walls, George," she used to say. But this wasn't pride anymore, and it was pain. I still tried to reach out. I sent Christmas cards, birthday gifts, small things. Most went unanswered. When he did call, it was formal, short, like he was checking off a chore. One evening, I overheard something that cut deeper than any insult could. I'd stopped by his office, unannounced, just to drop off a document he needed for an old property we still shared. I was waiting in the lobby when I heard his coworkers talking. "Who's that old guy out there?" one asked. David laughed softly. "Oh, that's just an old family friend. Not my father. Not the man who raised him, fed him, built his future from scratch. Just an old family friend." I walked out before he could see me. The air outside felt colder than it should have. From that day, something inside me shifted. I stopped calling. Stopped showing up. Stopped trying to prove I still belonged in his world. But deep down, I still hoped that one day he'd remember the man who gave him everything he stood on. And yet, I didn't know that the worst day of my life was still waiting just around the corner. The day he would look me in the eyes and then tell me to leave his house. Winter came early that year, the kind that bites through your jacket and seeps straight into your bones. The days grew shorter, the air sharper, and the weight on my shoulders heavier than it had ever been. My business, the one I'd built from nothing but a single hammer, a truck, and a dream, was gone. Just like that, it wasn't even my fault, not entirely. A partner I trusted made a bad investment. Something shady with a land deal that went sour. One lawsuit after another drained every dime I had left. By the time I realized the hole we were in, it was too deep to climb out. I tried to hold on, sold my old workshop, let go of my last 2 workers, and finally, with a knot in my chest, sold my truck. That truck had been my companion for 20 years. It had dents, scratches, and the smell of sawdust that reminded me of my youth. Watching another man drive away in it felt like losing a part of myself. After that, the silence hit. My small house was too cold, too empty. The bills piled up. I had no car, no job, and nowhere left to turn. So with hands that trembled more from shame than cold, I did something I never thought I'd do. I called my son. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Hey." "Dad," he said. His tone was cautious, uncertain. "David," I said softly, I need a place to stay for a while. Things have gotten bad, son. I lost the shop. I'm trying to figure things out." There was silence, long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. Then in the background I heard her voice, "Melissa." "What? He wants to stay here?" "No, David, you can't be serious." "Mel, he's my dad," he whispered, thinking I couldn't hear. "And I'm your wife," she snapped back, her voice cutting through like ice. "He'll make us look pathetic. The neighbors already talk enough. What will people think? Your broke father living under our roof." Then I heard David sigh. It was the kind of sigh that carried surrender. "Just for a few days, Dad," he finally said, "until you figure something out." I swallowed my pride and said, "Thank you, son. That's all I need. Just a few days." When I arrived at their house, the air felt colder inside than it did outside. Melissa opened the door, her face locked in that polite but displeased smile she wore so well. "Oh, George," she said, her eyes scanning my worn coat and single duffel bag. "You came faster than we expected." "I didn't want to be a bother," I said quietly. She stepped aside and motioned toward the guest room, a spotless, lifeless corner at the far end of the hallway. "You can stay here. Please make sure to keep it tidy. David and I both work long hours, so we prefer order." I nodded. Of course, that night dinner was awkward. They sat across from each other at the long table, laughing about work, about clients, about a new restaurant opening nearby. My plate came last, smaller portions, no words spoken. Melissa didn't look at me, and when she did, it was as if she were looking through me. "So, George," she said finally, cutting into her steak, "any plans on getting back on your feet soon?" David shot her a look, but she ignored it. I smiled faintly. "Trying, ma'am. Been applying here and there. Times are tough." She nodded with a smirk. "Yes, I'm sure they are." The next few days I did what I could to help in fixing the creaky stair, tightening door handles, cleaning the garage. I thought maybe, just maybe, my presence could be useful. But no matter what I did, Melissa's glare followed me like a shadow. I'd hear her whispering when she thought I couldn't hear. "He's always wandering around. It's unsettling. Or he smells like sawdust and old coffee. God, David, this is humiliating," David would murmur. He's my father. But even that started sounding weaker every day. One afternoon, while they were both at work, I found a box of old family photos tucked away in a drawer. Pictures from when David was a boy. There was one where he stood beside me at a construction site, holding a hammer twice the size of his hand. His smile could have lit up the sky. I held that picture for a long time, remembering a time when we were just father and son, before money, before pride, before all this distance. That night, during dinner, I tried to talk to him about those days. "Remember that time we built that tree house behind the old house?" I asked. He chuckled politely. "Yeah, I remember." Melissa sighed. "Honestly, I don't know why you'd risk letting a child use real tools. Different times, I suppose." Her tone dripped with judgment. David didn't defend me. He just kept eating. Something in me cracked a little. A few nights later, I couldn't sleep. I heard their voices from the next room. Melissa's whisper was sharp as broken glass. "He's embarrassing, David. The neighbors asked if he's your gardener." I froze. My heart clenched. David sighed, his voice tired. "Mel, stop. He's just going through a rough patch." "Rough patch?" she hissed. "He's living here for free, eating our food, making us look like some charity case. You promised this would be temporary." There was a long pause. Then David said quietly, "I know. I'll talk to him tomorrow." Those words, they echoed in my head the rest of the night. The next morning, the sun was weak, hidden behind gray clouds. I was sitting on the porch when David stepped out, dressed for work. His hands were in his pockets, his eyes avoiding mine. "Dad," he began, his voice hesitant, "we need to talk." I nodded slowly. I heard, son. You don't have to explain. He looked startled, like I'd read his mind. It's just, this arrangement isn't working. Melissa feels uncomfortable. We need our space, I could have argued. I could have reminded him of every sacrifice, every long night, every meal skipped so he could eat. But what was the point? He wasn't the boy I'd raised anymore. I stood up slowly. My knees cracked from years of labor. I understand, I said softly. I'll leave today. Dad, he began, but I raised a hand. It's all right. You've got your life now. I don't want to be in the way. He looked down. I'll send you some money once things settle. Money. That word again. Always money. I smiled faintly, though my chest burned like fire. Keep it, son. You'll need it more than I do. Then I picked up my duffel bag, the same one I'd brought when I first arrived, now heavier with disappointment than clothes, and walked out the front door. The air outside was cold and still. I didn't look back. I couldn't, because if I did, I might have broken completely. I walked down that street like a ghost, past the perfect lawns and trimmed hedges, past the people who looked at me with pity. My breath fogged the air, and each step felt heavier than the last. By the time I reached the end of the block, the sky began to drizzle. Not a storm, just a slow, steady rain. It soaked through my jacket, clung to my skin, but I didn't care. I'd been thrown out before, by fate, by failure, by loss. But never like this. Never by my own blood. That night I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The bed creaked, the heater barely worked, and the walls smelled of old smoke. But I lay there, staring at the ceiling, and made myself a quiet promise. This wasn't the end of my story. One day, David would see who I truly was. Not the broken man he cast out, but the man who built everything he stood on. He'd see it not through words, but through truth. See, what David didn't know, what no one knew, was that Miller Construction wasn't completely dead. It had fallen, sure, but not into ashes, just into silence. You see, when I was running my business in its prime, I wasn't just swinging hammers and building walls. I was learning. I watched how land moved, how permits worked, how properties changed hands. And over the years, I built something people didn't see, relationships, real ones. The kind that don't break when the money dries up. One of those relationships was with Eddie Carter. Eddie wasn't fancy, just a good man with sharp eyes and a handshake that meant something. Back when we were younger, we used to grab coffee at the same old diner off Highway 17. Two men talking about life, work, and what money does to people. When my company started to struggle, Eddie was the only one who didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with respect. He said, "George, you might have lost your business name, but not your mind. You know this industry better than half these kids in suits. Why don't you let me handle the paperwork while you sit back a little?" So I did, quietly. No noise, no headlines. I let him put things under his name. Small commercial properties at first, then some mid-sized developments. I was the silent hand behind it all. While the world thought I'd gone broke, I still had controlling shares in several of those projects. And one of those projects, funny enough, sat right in the heart of downtown, the very same district David's real estate firm was desperate to expand into. It's poetic, isn't it? The son who kicked me out for being poor was now fighting tooth and nail to buy land that his own father secretly owned. One morning, my old flip phone rang. I still used it, out of habit, out of simplicity. The voice on the other end was Eddie's. "George," he said with that raspy laugh of his. "You sure you don't want to show your face? You own half the downtown project, partner. They're all sniffing around for the big investor, and they don't even know it's you." I chuckled softly, staring out my apartment window at the city skyline. "Not yet, Eddie. Let them play their games. Let's see how they treat the man they think is poor before they find out who he really is." He laughed again. "Still got that patience, huh?" "Sarah used to call it stubbornness," I said with a faint smile. My new life was simple, quiet. I rented a modest apartment downtown, a small one-bedroom with creaky floors and a view of a narrow alley, not the skyline. But it gave me peace. I'd wake up early, brew my coffee, take long walks through the city, and no one gave me a second look. I liked that, being invisible. After all the years of building things, managing people, signing checks, being the man in charge, I was now just another face in the crowd, and somehow that felt right. Sometimes I'd walk by the construction sites where Miller Construction logos used to hang. My name was gone, replaced by new shiny brands. But deep down I knew those foundations were still mine. Every brick, every bolt, and it got stranger, because David's firm, the one that had turned me into a stranger, was unknowingly working to pitch deals to me through my company's holding group, which, on paper, looked like a separate entity. David's firm sent over multiple proposals. They wanted to purchase one of the downtown blocks I quietly co-owned. Eddie handled all the paperwork, so they had no clue who the real owner was. I'd sit at my small kitchen table, coffee steaming in front of me, reading the proposals they sent, polished, professional, full of buzzwords and promises, and at the bottom of each, signed in neat cursive, was my son's name, David Miller, regional director. There it was, my son, signing letters addressed to the man he'd once thrown out like garbage. The irony was almost too rich to swallow. I kept my distance, though. I didn't want revenge, not yet. What I wanted was truth. I wanted to see what kind of man my son had become without the shadow of his father standing behind him. And truth be told, the more I watched, the less I liked what I saw. David's firm was growing fast, too fast. They cut corners, used cheap contractors, manipulated clients. Eddie's company had been dealing with them from the other side of the table, and what he told me made my stomach turn. They're getting greedy. George, he said one afternoon, flipping through a folder of documents. Real greedy. That boy of yours, he's turning into one of those city sharks. Nice smile, sharp teeth. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to think he was still that boy who once held a hammer beside me, who used to say, one day, I'll build big buildings like my dad. But it was clear, and somewhere along the way, he stopped building and started taking. A few weeks later, Eddie invited me to sit in on a closed meeting between his firm and the buyers from David's company. He said it'd be fun. I wasn't sure what he meant, but curiosity got the better of me. We met in a glass-walled conference room downtown. I wore an old brown coat, my hair neatly combed, my beard trimmed just enough to look presentable. No one there knew me. To them, I was just Eddie's quiet partner, the man in the background. And then, the door opened, and in walked my son, David Miller, in a tailored navy suit, confident and sharp as ever. He looked older than I remembered, more polished, more distant. He shook Eddie's hand, all smiles. Mr. Carter, always a pleasure. Then his eyes shifted to me. And you must be. I stood, shook his hand firmly. George, I said simply. He nodded politely. You work with Eddie? Something like that. He didn't recognize me. My beard had grown thicker. My clothes were plain, and I didn't look like the father he remembered, or the man he chose to forget. Eddie sat down with a grin. David, why don't we discuss your offer for Block 7? David launched into his pitch, fluent and slick, talking about profit margins, projections, future developments. I watched him closely, the way he smiled at the numbers, the way he twisted his words to make every deal sound like a blessing. When he finished, Eddie leaned back, unimpressed. That's a good offer, David. But my partner here, George, he's the one you really need to convince. He's got the final say on this property. David looked at me, slightly confused. Oh, you do? I smiled faintly. You could say that. He gave a charming grin, the same one he used to flash when asking for an extra $1 as a kid. Well then, Mr. George, I hope you'll see the potential we're offering here. It's a win-win situation. I nodded slowly. Maybe, but sometimes, son, I paused. A win isn't really a win if you lose your integrity along the way. He blinked, thrown off for a moment, but quickly brushed it off with a laugh. Wise words, Mr. George, I'll remember that. If only he knew. That night I walked home through the city lights, the cold air stinging my cheeks. My heart was heavy, but it wasn't with anger anymore. It was with sadness and something else. Purpose, because now I had everything I needed. He didn't know who I was, he didn't know what I owned, and he had no idea that the man he'd once cast aside was about to become the reason his empire trembled. Not out of vengeance. Not out of hate, but out of a lesson that life itself had written long ago. Pride always blinds before it burns. Spring has a way of breathing life into even the dustiest corners of a man's soul. The air feels lighter, the colors sharper, the world somehow more forgiving. That morning, I woke up to the sound of city life outside my small apartment window. Car horns, footsteps, the distant hum of construction somewhere beyond the skyline. It used to hurt me hearing that sound. The grind of machinery, the pounding of hammers. It reminded me of what I'd lost. But lately it had started to sound like opportunity again. Eddie had called the night before. His voice, gravelly as ever, carried both excitement and a hint of mischief. "George, that downtown block and the one between 5th and Maple, it's going to auction next week. You might want to sit in on that one." "Why's that?" I asked, even though I already had a feeling. He chuckled softly. "Because your boy's company is going after it like sharks after blood." For a long time after hanging up, I sat in silence. The clock ticked. The city lights shimmered outside, and all I could think of was David's face the last time I saw him. Cold, distant, full of pride. That look when he told me to leave his house had burned itself into my memory. But this wasn't about vengeance alone. It was about something deeper, in truth. I didn't want to destroy my son. I wanted him to see, to remember, to understand the worth of a man's hands, not just the label on his suit. When the day of the auction came, the weather was perfect. A crisp, clear morning, the kind that feels almost cinematic. I dressed the way I always had, a worn brown jacket, scuffed boots, and a plain shirt. My hair had gone mostly gray, and I didn't bother combing it. I wanted to look ordinary, invisible, the kind of man people overlook, because that's what David had done to me, and today he was going to look again. The auction hall was a mix of noise and ambition. Businessmen and women in tailored suits filled the rows, murmuring numbers, sipping coffee, flipping through documents. The smell of perfume and freshly printed contracts hung heavy in the air. And there in the front row sat my son, David Miller. He looked powerful, the kind of man who had the world figured out. His suit was sharp, his hair neatly styled, his watch gleaming under the lights. Melissa wasn't there, but her ghost was, in his posture, his polished words, his every careful movement. He didn't notice me when I walked in. Why would he? I was just another old man in the back, holding a simple notepad, sitting quietly among people half my age. Eddie gave me a knowing look from across the room. We didn't need to speak. He knew what this moment meant. The auction began. Numbers were called, hands were raised, tension climbed like a staircase toward heaven. David's company, represented by him and 2 associates, bid aggressively. He smiled each time his offer overtook the rest. The crowd watched him with admiration, a young, confident businessman taking control of his future. But then, I raised my hand just once, calmly. The auctioneer looked at me, almost confused. Bid received. "Mr. I nodded slightly. "Cole. Richard Cole," I said. The name on my quiet holdings, my alias through which I'd built everything back again. David didn't turn right away. But when I raised my hand again, and again, each time outbidding him by a smooth margin, he finally looked back. And that's when our eyes met. For a moment, time folded in on itself. I saw that little boy again, 5 years old, standing on a job site, holding a hammer that was too heavy for his hands, looking up at me like I was a hero. But then I saw the man he'd become, guarded, proud, almost unrecognizable, his brow furrowed. Confusion flickered across his face, then shock, then something else, fear. No, not fear, recognition. He leaned toward his associate, whispering something. They glanced at me, unsure what to make of the old man in the back who refused to back down. When the bidding hit its peak, David's voice grew tense. 4.8 million, he said sharply. I waited a heartbeat, then raised my hand again. 5. The room went silent. Even the auctioneer hesitated, eyes darting between us. 5 million to Mr. Cole, he announced slowly. The hammer came down. Sold. For a moment no one breathed. I stood quietly collecting my papers while murmurs rippled through the crowd. David rose to his feet, his face pale, disbelief carved into every line. He stormed down the aisle toward me, his polished shoes echoing across the floor. "Dad? What the hell are you doing here?" His voice cracked slightly, caught between anger and confusion. I turned to him, calm as ever, and smiled gently. "Just buying back something I built years ago." He looked like he'd been hit by a train. You can't afford this. How are you even?" Before he could finish, Eddie stepped forward from behind me, arms crossed and grin wide. "Oh, I think he can, son. You're looking at the man who owns half the downtown corridor." Quietly, patiently, for years, David's lips parted, but no words came out. You could see the calculation in his eyes, the disbelief twisting into realization. His father, the man he'd called poor, the man he'd thrown out like garbage, was the very one his company had been chasing for months. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. I simply placed a hand on his shoulder, not out of pride but pity. "Son," I said softly, "you forgot something important. A man's worth isn't in what he wears or where he lives. It's in what he builds, and who he stands by when things fall apart." For the first time in years, he didn't have a comeback. The crowd around us watched, whispering, realizing the story that had just unfolded in front of them. David stepped back, his eyes glassy, humiliated. But beneath it, I saw something else rising. Regret. As I turned to leave, Eddie walked beside me, still grinning. "You sure know how to make an exit, George," I chuckled. "It's not an exit, Eddie, it's a lesson." He needed to learn who his father was, not by what I said, but by what I did. And as we stepped out of that hall into the bright sunlight, I felt something inside me settle. Not revenge, not triumph. Just peace. The kind a man feels when the truth finally finds its way. The city had already forgotten the auction. To the world, it was just another deal. Another number printed in a newspaper that would be read over morning coffee and then tossed aside. But for David and me, it was a turning point. The invisible wall between us had finally cracked. I didn't expect him to come. Not after that day. I figured he'd go back to his office, bury himself in meetings, pretend it never happened, the way proud men often do when truth hits too close to the heart. But sometimes guilt has a way of following a man home. It doesn't yell. It doesn't rage. It just whispers, quietly, constantly, until it eats through your silence. It was late afternoon when I heard a soft knock on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I'd been sitting by the window sipping black coffee, watching the orange glow of sunset stretch across the buildings. It was one of those evenings that felt peaceful and heavy all at once. When I opened the door, there he was, David. No expensive suit, no polished shoes, just a pair of jeans, a wrinkled shirt, and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in days. There was no arrogance left in him, only exhaustion and something deeper. Remorse. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city outside hummed, cars passing, a distant siren, footsteps on pavement. But between us, there was only silence. The kind that carries years of words unsaid. He finally broke it. "Dad," his voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" I didn't answer right away. I just studied his face and the way his jaw trembled slightly, how his hands fidgeted like a boy caught doing something wrong. He wasn't the confident man from the auction anymore. He wasn't the son who'd told me to leave his home. He was just my boy, standing there, stripped of pride. I motioned for him to come in. He stepped inside slowly, as though unsure he had the right. I poured him a cup of coffee, same way I used to when he was younger, and we'd sit on the porch after dinner talking about his dreams. He took it in both hands, eyes fixed on the steam rising between us. "Because, son," I said finally, my voice steady, "I wanted you to respect people for who they are, not what they own." He looked up, and I could see the pain behind his eyes, the kind that doesn't come from anger, but realization. "But you failed that lesson," I continued quietly. "You saw poverty as weakness. You looked down on me, on people like me, because you forgot what real strength looks like." He swallowed hard, his throat moving, as if the words stung. "I was wrong," he said softly, shaking his head. "I was ashamed of where I came from. I thought success meant distance, that I had to leave everything behind, including you." For a moment I saw his mother in him, the same honesty that used to come out only when he was scared or hurting. It softened me even when I didn't want it to. I smiled faintly, my voice low. "Success means gratitude, David, not pride. Your mother used to say, the moment you forget who fed you, you've already lost your way." He looked down. His hands trembled slightly around the coffee mug. And then, without warning, the tears came, quiet at first, then heavy. He tried to hide them, but he couldn't. And for the first time in years, I saw my boy. Not the man in the suit, not the executive in the corner office, not the son who was embarrassed to call me father. Just my son. He covered his face, shoulders shaking, and whispered through the tears, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." I leaned forward, my hand resting gently on his arm. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn, David. It's something you grow into, and by living differently." He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "I miss Mom, Dad. I think she'd be disappointed in me." I took a deep breath. "Your mother loved you too much to ever be disappointed. But she'd want you to remember the kind of man she believed you could be." He looked up then, and I saw something shift in him. Not pride, not guilt, but clarity. The fog of ambition had lifted, leaving behind the man he was meant to become. The sun had set by then. The room was bathed in a dim golden glow from the streetlights outside. For a long while, we just sat there, father and son drinking lukewarm coffee, saying nothing. Sometimes silence heals more than words ever could. Finally, he stood, wiping his eyes. "Dad, I want to make things right." "I don't know how yet, but I will." I nodded. "Start by remembering where you came from." "That's enough for now." As he turned to leave, I called after him. "David?" He stopped at the door, glancing back. "I'm proud of you," I said quietly. "Not for what you've built, but for what you've learned." He didn't speak, just nodded once, his lips trembling in that way they used to when he was a boy trying not to cry. Then he walked out, disappearing into the night, leaving the faint echo of footsteps down the hallway. I stood by the window for a long time after he left, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, my son was walking through the same streets I once built, maybe for the first time really seeing them, not as property, but as people's lives. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone, not because he'd come back, but because he'd finally understood. Time has a way of softening even the hardest edges. Months passed, seasons changed, and the bitterness that once sat heavy in my chest began to fade like old paint in the sun. David changed too. Not overnight, but piece by piece, like a man rebuilding a house he'd once set on fire. He started small, a phone call every few days, just to check in, then visits on weekends. At first, he'd show up awkwardly, standing at my door with that nervous half-smile, holding takeout bags instead of excuses. We'd sit by the window, eating and talking, mostly about ordinary things. The city, the weather, Eddie's new project. But slowly, beneath those small talks, there was something growing again. Understanding, respect, love that had been buried, but not lost. Eddie noticed it too. One afternoon, while we were fixing a ramp for a community center, he said, "Your boy's got his hands dirty again, George." Looks like he remembered where he came from. And he was right. David started showing up to help at the sites, hammer in hand, sleeves rolled up, just like when he was little. He didn't talk much those days. He just worked, sweated, listened. Every swing of the hammer felt like a quiet apology, not just to me, but to the man he used to be. I remember one afternoon vividly, the sun dipping low, golden light spilling across the lumber piles. David looked around at the half-built walls and said, "You know, Dad, I used to think building houses was just construction. But it's more than that, isn't it?" I smiled, wiped my hands on my jeans. "It's about people, son. We don't just build homes and we build trust. We build second chances." He nodded slowly, eyes softening. "Then I guess it's time I start building again." That was the first time I truly believed he'd changed. A few weeks later, on a bright Sunday morning, I got a call. "Dad," he said, his tone steady but gentle, "come over tonight." "Dinner's on me." I hesitated. That house, his house, held too many memories. The last time I'd stood on that porch, it was raining, and I'd walked away with everything I owned in a bag. But something in his voice made me say yes. That evening, I took the same slow walk up his driveway, same steps, same door, but the air felt different this time, warmer somehow, lighter. When the door opened, David stood there, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. Not polite, not distant, real. Before I could even say a word, he stepped forward and hugged me, a full, firm hug, the kind that speaks without needing language. "Welcome home." "Dad," he said. Inside, the house felt the same yet different, the same furniture, same walls, but there was a warmth to it now. Melissa was in the kitchen setting the table. She looked up when I walked in, and for a second I saw hesitation in her eyes, the same kind of shame I once saw in David's. But then she took a breath, walked over, and said softly, "Mr. Miller, I owe you an apology." I shook my head lightly. You don't owe me anything, but she insisted, no, I do. I was wrong about you. I judged you by what I saw, not who you were, and that's something I'll always regret. I looked at her for a long moment, then smiled gently. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, Melissa, I said quietly. It's about freeing your own heart so it can love again. She nodded, her eyes glistening, and for the first time, I saw kindness in her face, genuine, unguarded. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and cornbread like Sarah used to make. We sat around the same table that once held silence and tension, but this time, it was laughter that filled the air. David told stories about his early mistakes at work, and Melissa laughed until tears rolled down her cheeks. For a moment, I could almost feel Sarah there, sitting at the head of the table, smiling at us all, proud of what her family had finally become. Then, as the plates were cleared and the night settled in, David stood up with a glass in hand. He looked at me, not as a man looks at someone older, but as a son looks at his father when he finally understands what that word truly means. He raised his glass and said softly, "To the man who built more than homes, he built us." The room went quiet. Melissa placed her hand on his, and I felt something inside me loosen. The weight I'd been carrying for years, the ache of betrayal, the cold of that rainy night. It all just lifted because in that moment, I realized my revenge had never been about money or pride, or proving a point. It was about restoring something far more valuable: love, respect, family. After dinner, we sat on the porch, in the same porch where he once told me to leave, but now, he sat beside me, not above me. We watched the night settle over the neighborhood, lights flickering in the distance. He turned to me and said quietly, "Dad, I want you to move back in. This house was always yours more than it was ever mine." I smiled, shaking my head. "No, son. This house is yours now. I've already got a home. Right here," I said, pointing to my chest. "And it's full again." He looked down, smiling faintly. "You sure?" "I'm sure," I said. "What's broken doesn't always need to be rebuilt the same way. Sometimes it just needs to be remembered." He nodded, and we sat there in comfortable silence, father and son side by side, under the soft hum of the porch light. For the first time in a long, long while, I felt peace, not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from healing. The rain that once fell on that porch had finally stopped, and in its place there was stillness, warmth, and forgiveness. As I left that night, I looked back once, just to see him standing in the doorway, not as the man who turned me away, but as the man who finally found his way home. And maybe, just maybe, that was what Sarah wanted all along. Because some stories don't end with revenge, they end with redemption. When people ask me if I regret anything, I take a long breath before I answer, because regret is a heavy word, and I've carried heavier. But truthfully, no, I don't regret what happened. Not anymore. There was a time I thought I'd lost everything. My home, my pride, even my son. I thought that cold rain the day he shut the door on me was the end of my story. But looking back now, I see it wasn't the end at all. It was the beginning of something deeper, something stronger. Sometimes the people you love most need to lose you, not out of punishment, but so they can truly see you. They need to feel the emptiness your absence leaves, to understand the weight of your presence. And David, he needed that distance to find his way back home, not to a house, but to his heart. See, life doesn't always hand you justice in the way you expect. It doesn't always strike lightning or tear people down. No, sometimes God's justice is quiet, patient, poetic. He doesn't take revenge for you. He lets you live long enough to witness it yourself. To stand tall again, not with anger, but with peace in your chest. Now every morning, I still walk past that same porch, the same wooden steps that once echoed under my boots the day I walked away with my life packed into one old bag, the same door that once closed on me like a final sentence. But now, when I walk by, I don't feel shame. I feel strength, because those steps don't remind me of rejection anymore. They remind me of resurrection, of a man who was stripped down to nothing but found everything that truly mattered, of a father who learned that forgiveness builds bridges even when pride tries to burn them down. The funny thing about wealth is, it's never really about money. It's about dignity. It's about legacy. It's about the quiet kind of richness that lives in your character, not your wallet. I used to think success was building houses, big ones, strong ones tall enough to scrape the sky, but now I know better. Real success is building people. Because homes can crumble, businesses can close, fortunes can fade. But a good heart, that's a foundation that never cracks. When I look at David now, at the way he laughs, the way he helps his crew, the way he greets the janitor with the same respect he gives a client, I see a man who finally understands that lesson. And I realize, that's my legacy. Not the buildings, not the projects, not even the name on old company signs. It's him, my son, the man he became after losing everything that didn't matter. Some evenings I visit the old workshop, the one I sold years ago. It's abandoned now. Dust-covered tools, rusted nails, the smell of wood still faint in the air. I stand there for a while, just listening to the silence. Sometimes I imagine Sarah beside me, her hand on my arm, whispering, "See? He found his way, George," and I smile, because I know she's right. The truth is, we all go through moments when we're made to feel small, when someone we love looks us in the eye and makes us believe we're not enough. But that's not the truth. The truth is, those moments are tests, not of our worth, but of our strength. So if you ever find yourself standing in the rain, holding the pieces of a life that no longer fits, remember this: you're not broken. You're being reshaped. Sometimes you have to walk away from the place where you were unappreciated, so you can become the person you were meant to be. Because one day, the same people who doubted you will look up and realize, you never fell. You were simply rising somewhere else, and when that day comes, don't close the door on them. Just stand there steady and kind. And open it, because the truest victory isn't in proving them wrong, it's in showing them what grace looks like. Now, when I walk by that porch, I don't see failure anymore. I see a story, my story, carved into every wooden board, carried in every raindrop that once fell there. I see a son who learned to love his father again. I see a man who learned to forgive. And maybe that's what life's about. After all, not how high we climb, but how many times we stand back up. Not how much we earn, but how deeply we care. Not how far we fall, but how gracefully we rise. So when people ask me if I regret anything, I just smile and say, no, because if I hadn't lost everything that day, I never would have found what truly matters. Because in the end, every heartbreak builds a foundation, every betrayal tests its strength, and every act of forgiveness becomes the roof that keeps your soul warm. So if you ever feel unwanted, unloved, unseen, remember this: you might just be the lesson someone else needs to grow. And when truth finally knocks, when time turns full circle, you'll be the one standing there, not as the broken, but as the builder, smiling and opening the door.